Hello everyone, welcome back to a special edition of RotoViz Overtime. We are live drafting in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament. It is $125 entry to this contest. Really looking forward to this, Shawn. The first one of these we've done together this year. We are drafting against our RotoViz Overtime listeners, so it's going to be a sharp room with 11 other guys. I know there's some of them co-drafting as well, like us, so we're going to be up against more than 11 in total, but it's going to be a fun one as we draft hopefully a contender. Myself and yourself, along with Blair Andrews, were lucky enough to come second in this tournament last year. Of course, then Conor O'Driscoll took first place, so a RotoViz 1-2 finish. But this tournament offering some serious up-top prize money. I mentioned $125 to enter, $200,000 this year, Shawn, for the top prize, $50,000 second, $20,000 for third. So we're hoping to get in there again into those prize places this year. So Shawn, we got the 102 spot, and we joked recently that you weren't getting those high-end draft slots. Well, today we get one of them. It's the 102. We kick things off with Jonathan Taylor. So we have made that first pick. I'm going to show the draft board now for everyone to follow along. But how excited are you to first of all, jump in and draft in this tournament, and then against the sharpest room in the FFPC drafts here at the moment, the RotoViz OT listeners?
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to competing against the listeners. We've done a couple of these drafts in the Superflex format, which is obviously fantastic. That's one of my absolute favorites. It gives us an opportunity to go really crazy in that one, since if you pass on QB early, you're going to have a bizarre and potentially dynamic build. But obviously the roster construction explorers will tell you that going the quarterback at the beginning gives you the best chance to build that tournament winning juggernaut. Colm, we are back. This is our first 125 official OT league. As I was doing some research yesterday for a Dynasty article looking at the drafts that I'm doing with Patrick Corain and Matt Jones, I ran across the article from last year covering this draft after we had done it. And obviously that gave me a little bit of a feel of nostalgia. And that one's kind of fun. We'll be able to link back to, obviously, once we put this draft up, I'll have coverage of it on the site as well. But the big picture here, I think, is that we already had a debate at the 102. You wanted to go wide receiver, considering what this room is likely to be like. Talk about in OT drafts, obviously, in a ship chasing drafts, you have the wide receiver avalanche. That definitely occurred in all of our overtime leagues last year. And so one way to potentially address that would be to start with the wide receivers. Cooper Kupp did go at the 101. To a drafter who has participated on a number of occasions using the name Shawn's Twitter. And anytime Shawn's Twitter takes a wide receiver at 101, I think you've got to be excited about that. But I did convince you to take a running back. I don't know how many times we'll have a pick in the top three here where we can take Taylor or McCaffrey. I think that the way to play this will be to go hardcore wide receiver from this point on, but we'll see what happens. Wide receivers are going to get wiped out in the second round, I would expect at this point. We've had a fast and furious first round that's featured both Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews. But Colm, perhaps because of that weakness that we have discussed at times at wide receiver after, especially after Stephon Diggs and CeeDee Lamb are gone, maybe a few more running backs have actually gone in this draft than we would have expected. Derrick Henry at the 111, Najee Harris at the 202, both of them to Edgar. Those are some backs we've been able to select later in a lot of formats, and then Barkley goes at the 203. So the drafter there as well has started RB. Colm, is this a little bit of a surprise to you in an OT draft?
Yeah, I thought it might be a little bit heavier, but what I'm actually very pleased to see, and we're getting those wide receivers going off the board, but what we're seeing is teams taking specific approaches. Now, we'll see as the draft goes along, but Saquon Barkley at the 202, really trying to push that advantage to get that elite running back. Somebody we've talked a lot about, like that is pushing of where he would potentially go in a draft like this. If we look at current ADP, he's usually going as the RB9, 2 picks later than that. But we're going to see some guys, I think, take stands based on probably, Shawn, some of the information that we are sharing. We do get questions coming in about who are the most drafted guys we have. We see DeAndre Swift go off the board in this draft at the 107. Currently, usually the RB7 at the 203. So, going and getting their guys, he matches that up with AJ Brown. We get the Travis Kelce drafter taking T. Higgins. We get the Mark Andrews drafter doubling up and getting Kyle Pitts. So there's lots of interesting approaches here to start this draft off. What we have known, Shawn, from our RotoViz Overtime listener leagues is the ADP obviously is important, but we do see wide receivers go fast and furious. And you may see in this draft some of the running backs, particularly dead zone running backs, that may end up sliding around or 2 rounds. And then that makes it very tempting to try not to pass those guys up. But Shawn, we have talked about it before the draft. You said we had a little bit of a debate. I went with the Jonathan Taylor pick under the guys that we were going to really hammer these wide receiver positions. And our priority targets, which usually are 3rd round wide receivers, were AJ Brown, were T. Higgins. They go in the mid 3rd round here as wide receiver 7, wide receiver 8. But that also is sliding some players down towards us. So we are 2 picks away. The 2nd round so far has gone CeeDee Lamb, Najee Harris, Saquon Barkley, Kyle Pitts, Dalvin Cook, AJ Brown, T. Higgins, Deebo Samuel, Aaron Jones. We're 1 pick away. And we will talk a little bit more about this after our 3rd round pick, but we have shared a little bit of information of how we're planning to target this draft. We'll talk about that, Shawn, after this pick. But we are back in business. We're on the clock. It's a 60-second clock. We have 45 seconds left. Some of our options here are Javonte Williams, Tyreek Hill, Travis Etienne, or Jalen Waddle could potentially all be options. But I'm looking here at going towards the wide receiver option and Tyreek Hill, unless you want to hold off for Waddle later. But I think we either go Darren Waller or Tyreek Hill here, and I'm leaning towards Hill. How are you feeling?
Yeah, Hill I think is a good selection, especially with how loaded this draft is going to be with wide receiver drafters. It is a pick where you're probably going to see plenty of Jonathan Taylor with Tyreek Hill in the tournament. That part maybe isn't as ideal, but that's not something to worry about too much early on. If we had a guy that we really liked, we could have made the reach here. But the next wide receivers for me are back into that group that is just being overdrafted in Keenan Allen, Michael Pittman, Mike Williams. And so the next guy for me would be DJ Moore. Probably you mentioned waiting on Jalen Waddle. This kind of goes back to the very first pick, where if we had gone with Jamar Chase instead, which is the direction you were kind of leaning, Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase, then we would have had the option to take a couple of the interesting running backs who fell here. And I mean, Joe Mixon is going to fall into, well, at least a 212, if not into the 3rd round. Leonard Fournette, obviously, Javonte Williams. Colm, Joe Mixon is not a guy that we tend to believe is as talented as the running backs who should go early. He's not a player we've ever been high on, and yet at the same time, he does have that 1-week spike potential playing for the Cincinnati Bengals. We would be able to get a little bit of Bengals exposure in an unusual way for us if we selected him here in the 3rd round. And I mean, that's again within the context of this being a draft where you can get someone who has the 204 as their normal ADP. Do you prefer to go that direction? The other players we were kind of looking at, DJ Moore, Darren Waller, were selected. So we're kind of running into this issue that you mentioned. I convinced us to go Jonathan Taylor with the first pick. Who would you like to go here?
I think we either go Javonte Williams here or we reach for Mike Williams. I'll let you make the pick. One of the Williamses.
Well, if that's the case, we need to get some Mike Williams and get some exposure to a different way to play this.
Let's go. I was sure it was going to be Javonte.
We've been selecting a lot of Gerald Everett. I think that he is the way to play it, but we'll go with Williams here. See if he can maintain the fast start that he had last season. There may have been some injury elements in the middle that kind of sabotaged a year. And if he'd been able to maintain the first, 3rd of last season, which has never been his MO in his career, we're kind of looking for a guy to play above his ceiling. We're looking for that move from an older wide receiver. Both of those things are probably not the direction to go most of the time, but I think that it did make some sense in this particular draft. I do have Jalen Waddle ranked ahead of him. If we had not taken Tyreek Hill already, that would have been a direction that we could have attempted. Colm, now we're kind of on RB watch to see where some of these great values do fall.
Yeah, there's going to be extreme values here, and that's what I was saying about it's hard to pass those guys up. If we hadn't went with Jonathan Taylor at the 102, I would have been tempted to go either direction there. You mentioned Mixon. I think that Williams has the upside, but Mixon at this point of the draft in the mid-second round where we're at this point is an extreme value. But what is hard sometimes in a room like this, and I know people are drafting, for example, over at Underdog, and sometimes we see those wide receiver heavy drafts starting things off. But Shawn, you've talked about this for a number of years, that people talk about wide receiver being deep. It isn't really deep. And once you get locked out at the wide receiver position in drafts like this, you can be in big trouble. So you need to stick to structure, try and keep your roster going in the optimum situation. And we took Mike Williams there, kind of 6 to 7 picks ahead of ADP, usually going late third round. You mentioned, Shawn, he is even in that range of the Keenan Allen, Michael Pittman, who go back to back after him, who are kind of been overdrafted. If we hadn't have taken Tyreek Hill, I would have been open to going with Jalen Waddle. DJ Moore goes in the second round at 212 in this. Darren Waller. For me, Darren Waller would have been the pick if he didn't go with the 301. How would you have felt about Waller locking up that elite tight end in the third round versus Mike Williams if both of them were there? Is that the way you would have played it as well?
Yeah, that would have been a far superior way for it to work out. We probably should have gone with Waller there at the turn. One of the things that happens when the team drafting out of the 9th slot takes 2 tight ends, and you don't get much sexier than starting with Mark Andrews and Kyle Pitts, then there simply aren't as many tight ends left for the rest of us. We could have gone with George Kittle. I think that in many ways for me is a tricky play because of the wide receivers who are there and what the overall passing volume likely will be. I've ended up selecting Brandon Ayuk several times in recent drafts. He's falling. He's probably the way to play that team at this point. I don't think it's going to be a situation like last year where Debo and Ayuk completely flipped in terms of where they were drafting and how they scored. But with the talent level of both players, with Ayuk being one of these first-round draft picks who actually had fantastic peripherals in the second half of last season, I think within the dynamic that the 49ers are creating, you kind of have to go that route. But that does mean now that we do have the elite running back in Jonathan Taylor, but we don't have the elite tight end. Taylor and then Mark Andrews were obviously 2 of the key cogs in last year's second place finish. We're going to have to now make sure that we look to address that in some way, shape, or form later on in the draft.
Yeah, and it's going to be fun to see how some of these drafts play out. So we have kind of a 0 RB out of 1. We have hero or modified 0 RBs in our team in 2 and 3. Similar in 4. 5 is a 0 RB team with an elite tight end. 6 is an elite tight end 0 RB team. 2 running backs in team 7. Then we have Dalvin Cook to team 8. So kind of a hero RB so far. The double tight end with Joe Mixon. So they basically get Kyle Pitts and Joe Mixon as 2 second-round picks in terms of current ADP in this. They get a great value there on Mixon. Team 10, Gryffindor, who we've drafted with in a couple of the listener leagues recently, Shawn, starts off with the 3 running backs, Austin Eckler, Saquon Barkley, Travis Etienne. Then 11 has Derrick Henry, Najee Harris, now Deontay Johnson. And team 12, who stole my banana, starts off Stephon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb, Courtland Sutton, and then takes Rashad Bateman. So starts off 4 wide receivers out the gate. So you can see where you like the reaction sometimes in these can feel like let's go and let's start going to get the other positions and leave wide receiver because of it. But I said about reaching for Mike Williams in the last round. And this draft, I don't think it is a reach based on how the ADP is going to play out. First quarterback off the board is Josh Allen. So Shawn, I talked about this. We kind of jumped on at the start. We talked about our first pick, but looking through before this draft, we talked a little bit about it. And what prompted me to mention it on this show was you and Ben did some excellent Stealing Bananas shows over the last week talking about the draft strategy for redraft versus best ball when you're looking at maybe the FFPC main event. And Ben mentioned a few times about reverse engineering your draft or drafting from back to front. And that is something I think in a draft like this is so important to pick out your targets, the guys you want to have, and then to understand if you take this guy at the 2-3 turn, who can you get at the 4-5 turn? Who can you get as you go on? Who are you going to get in the 19th and 20th rounds to balance out that build? And the other thing we didn't get to talk about, Shawn, before we jumped on was I have put in the targets for those rounds. There's quite a chance that we are going to be bouncing those by maybe 1 round in each one of these turns. So the last couple of picks that have gone off the board are Joe Mixon, Travis Etienne, as I mentioned. After that Bateman pick, we get TJ Hawkinson, who tends to be one of our favorite tight end targets. Then we get Josh Allen, Leonard Fournette, Alvin Kamara. So Shawn, so far through those 4 rounds, we have 6 tight ends going off the board. For us, that tends to be the elite tier that we're trying to target. Sometimes I have been drafting along with Zachary Kruger in some of the drafts. He is targeting Dalton Schultz, for example. But that probably pitches us out now at tight end for a little bit. Breece Hall, next player off the board. Some of the players that are in our queue at the moment are Gabriel Davis, Jerry Jeudy, Cam Akers, J.K. Dobbins, Juju Smith-Schuster, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and then we're dropping into Drake London and Devontae Smith after that. Other players that are currently on the board are Nick Chubb, James Conner, Ezekiel Elliott, Cam Akers, David Montgomery, Dalton Schultz, who I mentioned, Terry McLaurin by ADP. Then we get Justin Herbert. So I think we still look to go wide receiver here if we can. In terms of looking ahead to how the draft may play out, I felt that the 6-7 turn was an area where it gets a little bit flat and could potentially be to get that first quarterback in this draft. But that could, as I mentioned, be bumped up a round or two. So Nick Chubb goes off the board. I think we go here to get our wide receivers again, Shawn, but some tempting, James Conner would be a tempting one to have there. You've Cam Akers in the queue, but I think at the moment, if the option arrives to us, I think getting Gabriel Davis and Jerry Jeudy would be the dream, but we are 2 picks away, and both of those guys could be gone before we even pick our first one of these picks.
They could, and these are guys with 5th round ADPs, but within the context of this draft, we wouldn't expect them to make it too much longer. After that, you're looking at more or less Juju Smith-Schuster and Amon-Ra St. Brown with ADPs of the 601 and the 602. But because we know it's going to force other interesting players down to us, that's actually not that big of a deal. And again, starting with Jonathan Taylor, we don't have quite the same pull to select one of these running backs that we might have otherwise. We can continue to load up. You look at a couple of the teams out there in the draft who decided to take advantage of some of the running back values, and the teams in the slot 9 and slot 10 haven't selected a wide receiver yet. To an extent, they're locked out, but we also know the flip side of that is that they're going to be very wide receiver heavy the rest of the way. So it's not like wide receiver value is going to start to show up, right? It's just going to get worse from here. And so you mentioned Gabriel Davis and Jerry Jeudy. They both are here for us. We have 10 seconds. Colm, who do you like first?
Yeah, I think we go with Davis.
The interesting story coming out last week on him is that he's up into the high 220s. If in fact he's able to maintain his athleticism at that level, I mean, you're talking about a potential world breaker in Gabriel Davis. It's funny that he goes earlier in best ball than in Dynasty. A little bit of that obviously has to do with that week 17 game between the Bengals and the Bills. That's inflating his ADP, just sort of big picture. If we don't end up with a way to play that game, then that selection may not look as good. At the same time, similar to what you kind of think about with what happened in playoff contests last year, and the big reason that he's so expensive right now, beyond the fact just that he's perfectly positioned to blow up, is that monster playoff game. And that playoff game specifically, you would have wanted him as the player in that. And there would be ways to go with that and win the game through him, and then with the rest of the strength of your lineup. So not necessarily a disaster, especially if most of the other Gabriel Davis managers actually have that game played that way. There is some benefit to having Gabriel Davis if he has the kind of season that we're looking at, but not having it in the same type of pattern that most other drafters are going to. So we come back around here, Colm, and perhaps not surprisingly, Jerry Jeudy and Juju Smith-Schuster do go off the board. Shawn's Twitter continues to be 0 RB with 4 wide receivers now and Darren Waller. We're looking at someone here like Cam Akers. I think that would be a way to play it. Amon-Ra St. Brown is interesting because he appears to be one of these great values, and at the same time, there are other ways to play the Lions and DJ Chark, and perhaps if you can build out enough wide receiver depth to make it through the early part of the season, Jameson Williams. And yet at the same time, there is a pretty significant tier break after Amon-Ra. What's your preference?
Yeah, I think we go Amon-Ra here. The only 2 other players that I would potentially go would be Schultz or Herbert, if you wanted to go tight end or quarterback, but I would go Amon-Ra if we're not going that direction. So we do take Amon-Ra. The reason I think I mentioned it earlier, I think we moved down into our targets here for tight ends. The issue with that, I think that I would say again with this draft room is, the jokes had even started before the draft had kicked off in the group chat regarding having Gerald Everett in their queues, having Noah Fant in their queues. So our favorite guys, Shawn, here are well and truly known, and we've seen TJ Hawkinson go off the board early in this one. We could see those other guys go ahead of ADP, so we'll play that out as it goes. We could potentially have gone Herbert to link him up then with Mike Williams, but I really like, based on this room, how things have played out so far. We've Jonathan Taylor, Tyreek Hill, Mike Williams, Gabriel Davis, Amon-Ra St. Brown. We're bumping some of those guys by half a round to a round in ADP in some situations. When you're drafting though at the turn, you kind of have to do that at times, because if you want a guy that's going a round and a half later, you're not going to get him when it comes back to you. So I think we're starting off quite well with this draft room. The other thing I was going to mention, you mentioned the ADPs of somebody like a Gabriel Davis get bumped up based on the week 17 correlations and some of the tournaments in ADP. It may not be as important when we look at a tournament like the FFPC in terms of the overall size of the contest. I mentioned earlier it is $125 to enter, but it is a 9,072 team contest. And like last year, Shawn, it is a case of it's multiple smaller leagues with eliminations until the teams get through to the final. The final in this tournament is a 63-team final. So it is obviously important, but we're not looking at quite the volume of people in the final week as we may be, for example, over at Underdog. So those correlations may not be, they're obviously going to be beneficial, but may not be as vital. And, last year, Shawn, for example, you've mentioned this a few times, we did have a Devontae Adams and Aaron Rodgers team, but in those final weeks, we used Devontae Adams basically every week, but we also were using Joe Burrow as the quarterback, obviously, because he was scoring more points overall than Aaron Rodgers. So that can be still beneficial in a tournament like this. So in the 5th round, we've seen Juju. This is a yellow round, Shawn. So since Alvin Kamara went off the board, we have seen in the next round 3 running backs go and Dalton Schultz. All other players were DK Metcalf, Terry McLaurin, Allen Robinson, Gabriel Davis, Juju Smith-Schuster, Jerry Jeudy. Then we get Amon-Ra St. Brown, Brandon Cooks, Russell Gage, Elijah Moore, Darnell Mooney. So we have 31 wide receivers off the board through 5.5 rounds. So we said, Shawn, after round 1 that maybe it was going a little bit less wide receiver heavy. It's definitely turned the corner. But again, to touch on it, we are basically moving the wide receivers up by a round to 2 rounds in a draft like this and dropping the running backs, particularly the dead zone running backs, down a round or 2. So we talk about this, Shawn, in terms of our draft or a RotoViz draft. This is probably the way ADP should look in terms of trying to remove the dead zone and trying to build those optimal lineups.
Well, one of the things that we've discussed on a few of the shows is that the ADPs don't really fit the various formats. And as a result of that, you have an opportunity to exploit ADP in both. That part of it is a lot of fun because there are so many things you can do to draft your player targets, but to get them in a way where you're actually getting them at a big discount as opposed to having to pay a premium to get the guys that you want simply by selecting them in the formats where it makes sense. I mean, the ADPs are broken. And so from that perspective, there are so many different ways then you can deploy your own board. And deploying your own board is still very important. We talk a lot about structural drafting. We talk a lot about making sure that you have sort of the right portfolio players, and the structural drafting in terms of how you need to put a team together. But then obviously in 2022, especially, there's been more focus on what you need to do for week 17. Some of those things that you do for week 17 can actually be pretty destructive for the rest of your roster. But you have this question of this puzzle of how can you do all of the things together? And one of the things that I think that you need to do is to make sure you're drafting the players where you need to draft them. So you're going to draft them around ADP, not wildly different than ADP. We get questions from time to time about, okay, if I followed Shawn's rankings, then I would end up with 100% of these handful of players. I don't really want that. And that's not the way that we want you to do it. We want you to draft them around ADP and to understand the other values in that area as well. So that sometimes you take slightly lesser values in order to make sure that you're getting decent prices on the players you are drafting. So that if I'm right about where they end up finishing, that you actually profit from that, as opposed to having kind of spent it all by drafting them at the place that they ended up finishing. And when you do that, then obviously you don't really get anything from it. You just drafted them at their finish, which is nice, but doesn't win you your league. So we need to have enough targets that we can be patient and that we can get values at the spot, but we also still want to draft the players just big picture who are better values overall, who are big wins, small loss types of players, and who have the very sort of widest range of outcomes. Now, you're not necessarily looking to take a team that is all risk at every draft slot. You don't necessarily want a team with all rookies, but even non-rookies, you're going to have players who have a much better chance to beat ADP than the guy next to them. We're targeting those players. We want to make sure that we have a high roster percentage of those players. And so that part of it makes a difference. And as we go through these drafts, we're going to keep an eye on who those guys are. You go back then to the structure. How do you make that work with it? And then you have a draft like this, which obviously is going to give you different challenges because it's not necessarily going to fall ADP, but you still have to make those decisions that work overall. And you mentioned drafting it from back to front, knowing kind of how it's going to play out. That part of it is just, it's so much fun here to do this draft with the RotoViz listeners. So from the point that you mentioned, we do get almost exclusively again wide receivers, Dallas Goedert. So we have a 3 tight end team. Ryan and Daniel in the 9th slot are putting together a really interesting build here. I don't know that it will work, but you're not going to see any other teams out there in the contest, or even contests if they had like millions of teams, that had Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, Joe Mixon, Leonard Fournette, Dallas Goedert, and Cam Akers through 6 rounds. So that part of it, I very heavily applaud. We now have 3 QBs coming off in this range with Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, and Patrick Mahomes finally going. Mahomes has been a discounted player, but unfortunately, Colm, we are also losing guys like Drake London, Devontae Smith, Treylon Burks, and Brandon Ayuk. I think all of them would be fun players, but as we kind of expected, they're not going to wrap back around to us.
Yeah, they would have been all potential targets, but no surprise that they didn't last. And then like the likes of an Adam Thielen going off the board, Chris Godwin, a player we love, but obviously injury concerns heading into the season. Adam Thielen, I've talked a few times about my concerns around his profile and his age heading into what will be his age 32 season, but we're going to see some of those guys kind of fall. What I was thinking, Shawn, and players I added to the queue were Justin Herbert, Patrick Mahomes, Kyler Murray. They have all gone off the board. This was the area of the draft I thought it might get a little bit flat and have the potential to lean into a quarterback pick here. We are 2 picks away. Ezekiel Elliott's there, Shawn. Don't make me draft him, please. But extreme value here at this particular point. Normally goes at the 36th pick. Is there a point where you would lean into Elliott? And how do you feel about potentially going quarterback here? We're 1 pick away. We have, in terms of ADP that are in, available to us, is Elliott, Dobbins, Josh Jacobs, Antonio Gibson, Elijah Mitchell, AJ Dillon. So a lot of running back options. Then we get Joe Burrow, Jalen Hurts, Miles Sanders, Amari Cooper, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Zach Ertz, Tony Pollard. So there's a lot of options there that we're not probably too pushed on. A lot of running back options in the queue, and Jalen Hurts goes off the board with that 1 pick before us. How are you feeling about this pick as it really does flatten out here a bit? It feels like we kind of either reach for somebody or we're going quarterback or running back here.
Yeah, at this point, it's a little bit interesting to consider taking DeAndre Hopkins, although that pick loses you some value as well when you're trying to win your own league. First, he's going to miss a huge chunk of the actual league time period. I think this one probably has to be J.K. Dobbins. He's one of our guys. He may continue to fall, but I wouldn't expect him to get back to us with another couple of rounds in this particular draft. And there really isn't another impact player here.
Yeah, J.K. Dobbins is the most upside of these running backs. So if you want to, Shawn, go that way, and I think then what we can see is who does come back to us in 2 picks time. But it's going to be interesting. It's a really challenging draft as you kind of, we have our setup here where we can have using the RotoViz tools, looking through the ADPs, trying to see what options may be available in the coming rounds, as I mentioned again, drafting back to front to see how your roster will play out. I think though there, J.K. Dobbins to pair up with Jonathan Taylor, based on the wide receivers then that we have in this format, been able to start the multiple wide receivers in the flex obviously is going to be beneficial. But yeah, I think we're in an interesting spot, Shawn. I would have went Jalen Hurts there if he had lasted one more pick. Would you have went Hurts over Dobbins, or would you still have pushed for the Dobbins pick?
Well, I think with Hurts making it, if he had done that, then we would have had both Hurts and Burrow. And I don't necessarily think, especially since we did take that selection of Gabriel Davis, that I would feel a huge need to have Hurts over Burrow. Now, I have them ranked in a similar way. I think that I have Hurts and Lance, because of the things that they do for you structurally, the flexibility they give you, the multiple ways that they win. I have my roster percentage for both of them is extremely, extremely high. So I'm not arguing against Jalen Hurts in any way, shape, or form, but in some ways it's almost a relief to have a draft where he wasn't the clear pick so that I can differentiate or diversify just a little bit in terms of that portfolio. What are your thoughts here? We don't really have a player at a different position. Joe Burrow is a good fit. He was the player who got us to second place last year. He would be right in there with Jonathan Taylor. So we would have some callbacks to last year's team if we go Burrow here.
Yes, I don't think you're expecting any pushback here, are you?
No. So we do take Joe Burrow. We have Jonathan Taylor and J.K. Dobbins. I think that both of them could be league winners. Despite going wide receiver in rounds 2 through 5, it's not that dynamic of a receiving core, but they are players that we do like. And then we have Joe Burrow, who, with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, one of the elements here that I think people get caught up in is that due to the way in which the running quarterbacks score, especially the hybrid quarterbacks, when you're talking about a Josh Allen and his potential to put up a bunch of rushing touchdowns, when you're talking about Kyler Murray and Lamar Jackson, their potential to put up huge numbers in terms of rushing yardage and then also score some touchdowns. Jalen Hurts into that category, Trey Lance into that category. Ben has been discussing his projections for Lance and how they're absolutely massive. As I mentioned before, I've been drafting Lance all the way up, and the only times that I miss on him are when he goes very, very early. All of that makes sense, and you need to have a lot of exposure to those players. But the reason that a Justin Herbert will go fairly early, the reason that a Patrick Mahomes will go fairly early, the reason that a 45-year-old Tom Brady will go ahead of where sometimes it seems intuitive, the reason that people are still interested in Aaron Rodgers despite not having any weapons, the reason that a Drew Brees and a Peyton Manning would have always been interesting players. And now, I mean, imagine if you gave Peyton Manning, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins, and then, oh, by the way, they have Tyler Boyd, the best slot possession receiver in football, as the third guy. As the Bengals evolve, I mean, sure, there are plenty of scenarios, and there is a huge sort of chunk of the probability pie to where the Bengals are ahead. They're not that aggressive. They don't throw with the lead in the same way that the Chiefs and the Bills do. And you get numbers that are good, but not league winning. There are also plenty of scenarios here where Burrow goes out and has one of those 5,000-yard, 50-touchdown seasons. And when you're drafting in this area, when it makes sense with the rest of your build, I think that you want to shuffle a few of those in there. And when you're thinking about week 16, week 17 upside, there just aren't that many teams who have multiple receivers who could go off for 200 yards and multiple touchdowns and even could do it together, right? And we talk a lot about losing to Connor's team because he obviously had Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, and we weren't quite able to make up the Chase stagger with the just insane game that he had. But the score that put him over the top was the Joe Burrow score to Tyler Boyd, who was also on his team and created the final gap, right? And so when you have a quarterback of Joe Burrow's caliber and you have those types of receivers, what we saw in 2021 was just the tip of the iceberg, right? Even what we saw in the playoffs where they really relied on a very good defense in some ways. And yeah, I mean, you can mention that probably isn't ideal because the way in so many cases that a superstar quarterback hits his very peak seasons. Now, I mean, when you're talking about a Peyton Manning or a Drew Brees or, as it's beginning to look for Patrick Mahomes, I mean, you're going to have very good seasons every year, but those ones that really stand out as being the record-breaking campaigns, there are some dynamics, at least sometimes, where defensive weakness or defensive injuries will then force that team into a passing mode that allows for the total number of attempts that gets you where you need to be. But that could happen this season. I mean, the Bengals could suffer some defensive injuries. One of the things that we don't always think about quite as much, but one of the reasons that defense can be difficult to project in the way that so many things can be difficult to project is that their players get hurt and the defensive players rely on each other. You hear about sort of offensive line continuity and that kind of thing, but so much on the offense can be covered over if you have a star quarterback. On the defense, you lose some of those players and you lose some of that synergy, and suddenly it's a very different unit. So we're playing one of these scenarios that Joe Burrow has a massive season when we draft him here, but it's also a high floor play. We talk all the time about drafting two quarterbacks in the window. One of the things that we're seeing in this draft is, yes, wide receivers are being inflated, but at the same time, the drafters are not being super conservative at QB. They're all everyone's eyeing each other and knowing not everybody is going to be able to execute that. And it is a very key part of winning in best ball.
Yeah, this is awesome, Shawn, so far, this draft. I was really looking forward to getting in and drafting in the challenge of it, but this is a lot of fun. We'll see how our team turns out, but yeah, it's really challenging. I added some players into our queue, the likes of, Sky Moore, and you're thinking, yeah, he might be there, maybe even in the 10th round, and then he goes at the 7-12. So there's a lot of interesting draft strategies happening as we look in terms of ADP, the quarterback. So between the 5-12, we get Lamar Jackson, then 2 picks later, we get Justin Herbert. But then in the mid-6th round, we get Patrick Mahomes, Kyler Murray, then 2 picks later, Jalen Hurts. Then we take Joe Burrow, then Russell Wilson, Trey Lance, and Tom Brady going off the board in the 7th round. And that kind of is relatively close to where these guys go in terms of ADP. They're usually all off the board in the 7th round range, outside of Trey Lance, who usually goes half a round later. But people are trying to put those, Shawn, your piece is obviously the Best Ball Workshop. People probably have those open as they're drafting against us, and you talked about your rankings. So all edges that we possibly could have in this draft are probably wiped out, but Garrett Wilson going off the board. But Team 12, Shawn, we're going to have to keep an eye here. They are really flying the flag for zero RB with a Stephon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb, Cortland Sutton, Rashad Bateman, stacked with Lamar Jackson, Treylon Burks, Sky Moore, Chris Olave. So we're getting 3 rookies in there. Going to be fun to see how they play that out. But in a draft like this, when you can build up those receivers, there's going to be some interesting options here for them at running backs, because at this point of the draft, we currently have 49 running back or 45 wide receivers drafted. There's 24 running backs drafted in this room. So there's going to be options for Team 12 to start to build that out. We do see Christian Kirk, Amari Cooper, Michael Thomas, Garrett Wilson, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, and then Chase Claypool going off the board. So a couple, Shawn, of options in Thomas and Cooper that we're probably passing. I haven't drafted Christian Kirk at all this year. He got obviously paid a lot of money, but not really drafting in there. Dak Prescott goes off the board to the team in 4th. So we're 2 picks away. Shawn, there's a lot of running back options again here. Based on how we're looking at things, it probably makes sense for one of the picks to be a running back, because there's a lot of the guys we like here, but we do have 2 running backs so far in Dobbins and Taylor. How are you feeling about this pick, or is there somebody else that is catching your attention here at the moment?
Well, with so many of the wide receivers being gone, I do think it's worth considering Rondale Moore and Tyler Boyd, both players who, number 1, fit, and number 2, with Moore especially, you have him as a potential breakout candidate. I don't know at the running back position that the values are where I would want to see them to take a pick in this round, because the values are really on Josh Jacobs and Miles Sanders from an ADP perspective.
Yeah.
But Josh Jacobs, there are huge problems with his profile for this season.
The other thing I was going to mention is I do think that we're going to see, like, at the moment, there is Josh Jacobs, Miles Sanders, Edwards-Helaire, Walker, Hunt, Singletary, Harris, Edmonds, Patterson, Penny, Cook. All, like, there's a lot of those guys we like, and there's a good chance that some one of those guys are going to pop back to us in the following round. So you have Rondell Moore top of the queue. Tyler Boyd obviously would be able to pair into that, the Bengals situation with the Bills, but I think we go Moore for Shawn to make sure we get him, and then we go Boyd after. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, that'll work great. And it would have been interesting to select Dak Prescott if he had lasted 2 more picks, but he goes at the 8:09, doesn't make it back to us at the 8:11. I don't think that the rest of the quarterbacks here, Colm, are necessarily must-draft players at the 8-9 turn. We have Matthew Stafford, Derek Carr, Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins, and Justin Fields as the top players by ADP. Obviously, Tua would have a little bit of intrigue as he connects to Tyreek Hill, but I'm not necessarily playing that, even though I like both of those wide receivers. If anything, making a bet on someone like Daniel Jones, or if we ended up with Jameson Williams later and were to try and hit on Jared Goff, something like that would probably be more appealing than reaching for these guys here. Obviously, Derek Carr and Justin Fields, 2 quarterbacks who are priority targets for us, but again, probably not to start out the 9th round.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And the guys there that they would be the 2 guys we're targeting in this range, and hopefully maybe one of those would slide to us. Josh Jacobs and Matthew Stafford do go off the board, so that gives us an option, Shawn, to get Tyler Boyd here. And I think, one for old time's sake, get Mr. Boyd on the roster.
So you obviously love Tyler Boyd. He is one of the poster folks for the OT podcast in the intro music at many different times. The 2 wide receivers sort of ahead of him still by ADP are Robert Woods and Tyler Lockett. They fall into weaker situations this year. It doesn't mean that they will score fewer points, but I do like Boyd here. We do have the chance to take someone like a Galladay, a Jahan Dotson, Jarvis Landry, Jameson Williams, but Tyler Boyd is going to be our pick.
Yeah, I think he fits what we're looking to do here in terms of the correlation. So I know I mentioned earlier it's not as important maybe as the larger field tournaments, but in terms of having that option based on wide receiver ADP at the position only, not based on wide. Obviously, he would usually go quite a bit later, but in this room, by wide receiver position ADP, he would be in this current range. Tyler Lockett, you mentioned the situation. I do think that at this point, he is becoming a value in all formats. I think he's just, kind of been forgotten about a little bit. Same, I think DK Metcalf's a value. I'm probably going to end up drafting more of them as we continue to move forward. We recently drafted Metcalf on a roster together, Shawn. I've drafted him a couple of times over the last week in drafts singly as well. So we are in a fascinating draft here as we play things out at the current moment in time. So far, there have been 30 running backs selected in this draft, 54 wide receivers, 9 tight ends, and 14 quarterbacks. So we're into the late 9th round. Our team so far is Jonathan Taylor, Tyreek Hill, Mike Williams, Gabriel Davis, Amon-Ra St. Brown, J.K. Dobbins, Joe Burrow, Rondell Moore, and Tyler Boyd. How are you feeling about this roster so far, and how do you think this team is going to play out over the next 11 rounds to try and compete for this championship?
I love it. It's been so much fun, and the team has come together nicely with both a good floor and a good ceiling. We have Taylor and Dobbins as very high upside running backs. Obviously, we have the upside QB there. For our overall portfolios, we're desperately hoping that Jamar Chase and T. Higgins stay healthy, but obviously in a situation where one of them was banged up for a bit, you could have a massive season from Tyler Boyd, and obviously you can score plenty of points, including getting in the end zone, even when those guys are healthy. We've gotten around to the end of round 9. Some of those fun running back names that we like to talk about are starting to go here and are going in some ways a little bit closer to ADP because a few of those pure dead zone players perhaps are hanging around just a bit. But the other big dynamic that we have witnessed in this draft column Dalton Schultz and Dallas Goedert did go in round 5 as drafters tried to make sure that if there is some upside there, that they went ahead and got it. But then it's been very light on tight ends despite the FFPC format between round 6 and the end of round 9. Dawson Knox, the only tight end who went. So again, we're seeing the RotoViz influence, the best ball tools influence. You can go to the best ball Explorer and look at the positional heat map, and it will show you just how weak tight end scoring is in that 6th to 9th-ish round range. You wait here into the double-digit rounds, and you start to get those tight end values again, and you can build up 2, or if you haven't gotten one before, preferably a 3 tight end build at this point. So nothing that we wouldn't expect, but the RotoViz drafters are again doing what you would want to do if your goal is to build a structure that will win this league first, which is the first hurdle that you have to get across, and then to win the overall tournament.
Yeah, so smart drafting overall. The player that I was about to ask you about just did go off the board. We did talk about Justin Fields and in the last kind of round range, and he almost slipped all the way back to us. Derek Carr did go in the previous round. Christian Watson after going off the board then. So some of the players, Shawn, that are available to us, again, a lot of the running backs that I touched on in the previous round are still there, the likes of Kareem Hunt, Rashad Penny, Melvin Gordon. We do have some tight ends, though, that are available here if we did want to go that route, that we do have the likes of Pat Fairmouth, Mike Gesicki, Albert Okuabunam. A little bit later, we would be looking towards somebody like a Noah Fant and a Gerald Everett. What are your thoughts here? Irv Smith, after going off the board, we're 1 pick away. Based on how the draft is going, and it seems like people were listening, as you mentioned, the tight ends not going. We have 3 tight ends going off the board in this particular round. Albert Okuabunam goes off the board in that next selection. So we're on the clock. What are you thinking about playing out here?
Well, I think we could go with Kareem Hunt. Shawn's Twitter in the interim only has 1 running back, and I wouldn't be surprised if he uses this opportunity to take the good values in Hunt and Penny. There are enough tight ends, I guess I would feel comfortable letting them slide through and see who comes back around. So Hunt, still someone who has that extreme upside. He's falling because the Cleveland Browns quarterback situation is no longer nearly as appealing, and yet that could lead to more total running back touches. It could also lead to a situation where either Hunt or Ernest Johnson is moved before the season starts. Yeah,
I'm willing to go with Hunt here and see how it plays out. Fairmouth, I think, is an interesting tight end. Okuabunam was probably the one I would have hoped to get. And then the one, Shawn, and it's a bit tricky, we obviously have Tyreek Hill, so there is the possibility, and I don't get the feeling that you're overly optimistic about him this year, but if you think that he has Waddle and also has Tyreek Hill, this is the range that Tua Tagovailoa would normally go in. Any interest in pairing him up with Joe Burrow and settling for a 2-quarterback build here?
I think that we have to get a better value. There are still so many running backs and so many tight ends that we need. I don't know that there is much separation between Tua and a lot of the guys who are available later. We talk about the importance of getting the 2 QB in the window, but that doesn't necessarily mean if you get locked out, and I would have loved for Justin Fields to get back to us. He did not. If you get locked out of the guys that you legitimately believe are in the window, then at that point, you want to take the value at quarterback as opposed to kind of lock yourself into taking someone who perhaps is just the same player that you can draft 5 rounds later. And so what we do see happen here is that Ronald Jones and Noah Fant go. So a reach by ADP for Fant, but someone who is wildly undervalued. Obviously, we're never going to criticize our Ronald Jones selection. Perhaps not a surprise there, but that means that Freiermuth is still available. And at this spot, I mean, he's a near 100% roster guy in Dynasty. I think there are some red flags for the upside in 2022, but there's also breakout potential here. At this price column, I don't know if we can pass.
Yeah, no, I think we have to. You also get into a situation where I think Fairmouth still gives you access to a 2 tight end build. I think if you you could have done that with Gesicki potentially, but when we look at tight ends that are left, we have Hunter Henry, Gesicki, Everett, Tonyan, Higbee, Ingram, Njoku, Hooper, Brait, Hurst, Brevin Jordan, who, Shawn, one of these days we're going to get a Brevin Jordan team. Will it be today? But he's somebody that I continue to pitch for. But you're into a range where it's 3 tight end builds if you don't have a tight end at this particular point. I think it's going to be interesting. So that's where it goes. I've drafted Fairmouth a couple of times recently. As most people know, I have too much exposure at this point to TJ Hawkinson, but a draft that I recently missed out on Hawkinson, I got Fairmouth in a couple of those. Mike Gesicki goes off the board. So, Shawn, really, you can see that influence as when you touched on the start here, we were talking about no tight ends going for quite some period of time there. Since that, we have 7 tight ends go in the last kind of round and a half range. So looking to build up on that. So far, team 1 is 2 tight ends. We have 1. Team 3 is 1 tight end. Team 4 is 2 tight ends. 2 tight ends in team 5. 2 tight ends now in team 6 as Everett goes off the board. No tight ends for team 7. So they could be looking now to move towards that 3 tight end build. They also have Kirk Cousins, so they might get a little bit squeezed into a 3 quarterback build. It gives you a little less option then in the flexibility for those other positions. 1 tight end for team 8, 3 tight ends early for team 9, and then, for team 8, and then 2, 1, and 0. So team 12 also 0 tight ends at this point. So could be a little bit of a squeeze on some of those rosters. I think that Fairmouth there was the smart choice. Somebody who you mentioned having a lot of exposure in Dynasty, but have you drafted much of him this season? I keep going back to the Steelers situation. I don't know if any quarterback could, put up as bad a play on tape as Ben Roethlisberger did last year. I think they all have to be an upgrade no matter who we get playing quarterback for the Steelers this year.
In so many ways, and yet Ben Roethlisberger brings you don't want to say veteran savvy because, again, so much of it was really not that savvy at all. But the experience, I think that we could see a much more dynamic play overall. Freiermuth obviously was a red zone threat. You hope that he can maintain that as we really go with 2 quarterbacks who have a lot to prove or just have a lot to do developing. And I don't know that we're going to see the big jump from the offense that we might hope to see in 2023. At the same time, rookie QBs have provided that jump numerous times in the last 5 years. So if they do manage to hit on Pickett, then those are some fun selections there. The other thing, Colm, we probably should have done was simply to take the 2 tight ends. Take Fant Freiermuth or go with Freiermuth. And our favorite player, Gerald Everett. It would have been interesting to go with Gesicki because we had the 2 wide receivers. Gesicki and Everett weren't as interesting to me. Obviously, Albert O goes 1 pick ahead of us. We'll see what happens there at tight end. One of the things that we have mentioned is that tight end is the other position that in these RV drafts you can sometimes get locked out on because when the run happens, it happens with such ferociousness that coming out the other end of it, no one is left.
Like if you look at in this draft, Shawn, in particular, from the 10-09, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tight ends and an 11 pick span. So teams are going to get locked out here off tight end. And it's just when you're making that pick at 10-11 and you miss out on Alberto, you're kind of thinking there is a couple of tier splits here. And it is reaching, but then, when Fant goes off the board, it is a case in this draft. If we were in a different draft room, we're probably thinking, yeah, we take one of these guys and then one of them may get back to us in the next round. But here, there's no chance of that playing out for us. So, in hindsight, maybe we should have done that. But if you were talking, 1 hour before we start this draft, we're probably not thinking, yeah, in the 10th round, let's double up on Fant and Everett and those 2 picks. So, I still think we're into a good spot here. Still lots of options and flexibility of what we can do. Fairmouth isn't that elite tight end, but when we're looking at those players who could ascend, and I mentioned the quarterback situation potentially being an improvement this year, but you're also looking at a young player who has shown what he can do in the NFL, could take that step forward. So I think he's a really interesting tight end in this particular range. He's probably kind of, Shawn, gives me that feeling that I probably had for Mike Gesicki a season to 2 seasons ago, but it never has fully just clicked for him. We've seen flashes. Maybe Fairmouth can give us those full explosive seasons here as we move forward. But we do have a lot of flexibility. We do have 3 running backs now in Jonathan Taylor, J.K. Dobbins, and Hunt. Then we have the wide receivers, still the 7, and Hill, Williams, Gabriel Davis, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, Rondell Moore, and Tyler Boyd. So lots. I think we're in a pretty good spot based on 11 rounds of this particular draft. We're going to call it out now, Shawn, as the 1201 is about to be picked. Who is your dream 2 picks in the 12-13 turn? You give yours, I'll give mine. And we can then watch as they both get drafted before we get to our pick.
Well, at some point, Cordero Patterson was going to get very, very interesting. He goes at the 1201 right there. You think of, even if he doesn't have quite the efficiency and doesn't have quite the workload that he did last season, his scoring level was so high and his individual game upside was so impressive that once you get into the 12th round range, you very much want to add him back onto your roster. He doesn't come back around. We also had Tua go, so that becomes no longer an option. Trevor Lawrence and Tua go into the last 3 picks of round 11. There's a possibility of using a 3 QB build if they get inexpensive enough and we hit a flat area very, very late. Colm, I don't know. I'm starting to have some enthusiasm for Jameson Williams here. I think that we have enough wide receivers to kind of wait him out, and his upside in a playoff scenario would be very exciting. I don't know who I would go with the other one. We have Melvin Gordon falling quite a bit, but I want Javonte Williams to stay healthy. Colm, I have burned some of your time. Who do you like here? Who are you looking for at the 12-13?
Yeah, so when you were mentioning Jameson Williams, DJ Chark did go off the board, another Detroit wide receiver. I think that Gordon is interesting. Somebody in a more of a 0 RB build. If we didn't have any of those running backs we have, I would certainly be looking to target here. I think Jameson Williams becomes very interesting based on the wide receiver depth we have. So when we look at the kind of conversation around somebody, let's say like a Chris Godwin, is that he's going to miss the start of the season, probably the first 6 weeks or so, potentially more. You're not going to have him for that section of time. In this draft, for example, he is the wide receiver 4 on that roster. We're looking at somebody like a Jameson Williams. If he would last to us, he would be our wide receiver 8. There is that, period of time where we can, and as I say that, he goes off the board. But he could have been that option where he fits that build and he could be healthy for it to be the late season hammer for you. So, Shawn, I told you the pick would go. Jameson Williams was who you were hoping for. The running back options that are there for me that I would be interested in if we were in more need of running back are Melvin Gordon, Kenneth Gainwell. Melvin Gordon just goes off the board as I mentioned his name. Isaiah Spiller's there as well, but I would prefer if there was more options outside of running back available here. But when we look down through them, the only wide receivers by ADP that will be available really at this point is Michael Gallup. Tight end would be Evan Ingram. Quarterback would be Daniel Jones. And next wide receiver is McCole Hardman. So we're in a pretty flat area of the draft here for me, Shawn. So unless we decide to, take a reach on somebody, wide receivers that kind of might fit what we have built so far could potentially be a Gabriel Davis. We're into that flat range for potential quarterbacks like Daniel Jones. And then we obviously have the running backs that I mentioned at the top. But how are you feeling now as we're on the clock, 45 seconds to go?
Well, Evan Ingram was the other player I was really hoping was going to slide to that spot. He does go 1 pick ahead of us. That really throws us into something of a quandary here, Colm. But there are some guys that we do like. It's tricky to be in a draft where you're getting all of these running back values and then perhaps take a running back who isn't an extreme value. But I do think that any draft in which you don't have Breece Hall, you have to seriously look at Michael Carter. He had excellent peripherals last season. And then even though it will be a little bit ahead of time, Daniel Jones is the other big time QB who is available right now. And since we didn't get the two QBs in the window, and Daniel Jones is the player with tournament winning upside and still has some compelling wide receivers who haven't been drafted yet, it seems like that's the direction we have to go.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know if, Shawn, if you clicked that pick or if I clicked it, but we were getting down to the kind of 3-second range. So when we're drafting at the FFPC, we can set up co-manage rules so I can click the picks as well. But at the top of the queue was Kenneth Gainwell, who I do like and I think comes into consideration here at the next pick if he lasts to us. But I was thinking, are we getting the pick? Are we taking them? So we take and we get Daniel Jones. One question on Daniel Jones, we mightn't have time to really go into it before it's back to our pick, but some reports over the last couple of days of potentially the Giants looking at Jimmy Garoppolo more as a mentor role, and then if Daniel Jones, fails, early in the season, somebody who could take over. Any concerns with that with Daniel Jones? It feels to me like either way, we're into make or break territory, but the value of getting him here in a draft at quarterback 19, I think gives such upside.
Yeah, well, I think if they add Jimmy Garoppolo, that's sort of a death knell for Daniel Jones. It's definitely not what you're wanting to hear. I can't imagine that that's the direction that they're going to go, because you just need to see what he's going to do. And then
I think they need to.
You set yourself up for a young quarterback. Adding Jimmy Garoppolo to the Giants, you never know what these teams are going to do. Jimmy Garoppolo is actually quite a good quarterback. It'll be unfortunate for him if he's left without a chair this season. You should be adding him to the end of your dynasty rosters. The Giants situation doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, we're on the clock again, 36 seconds to go. You mentioned Michael Carter. I mentioned Kenneth Gainwell. The other name that would potentially be there, which we would be reaching on, but would be one of the next wide receivers of interest, would be Jamison Crowder. Which way do you want to go here?
Two interesting running backs did go at the turn in Isaiah Spiller and Darrell Henderson. Spiller, someone who could have an absolutely monster season if anything happens to Austin Eckler. That's a really nice selection coming back after the team in the 101 started with 5 wide receivers and Darren Waller, an elite tight end, in their first 7 picks. They've now added a ton of running back upside. Colm, I mentioned that Michael Carter has to be the guy anytime that you don't have Breece Hall. You pull up the Advanced Stat Explorer and see that he was one of the best running backs in football last year. He's got that hybrid ability. He creates big plays. He can be a receiving back for you. He's going to get buried by Breece Hall, who immediately becomes one of the most talented running backs in the NFL. But backs don't stay healthy. And he's going to have a little bit of standalone value. They want this to be a committee. And then if the offense takes a step forward, if Breece Hall misses some games, you're talking about Michael Carter at running back 44 being a player who has the ability to be sort of at the RB1, RB2 borderline in the scenario where he moves into kind of the main role on the team. So we like having him there as the 4th running back. Our running backs column, as we like to do with it, they have just absolutely extreme upside. All 4 of them very, very talented. Yeah,
very talented. So it's always that case as well of when we're looking at the running backs. You mentioned running backs do get injured, unfortunately, but we've drafted a lot of Breece Hall. Sometimes then it can balance exposure, but I do think Michael Carter, like you said, was impressive in his opportunities last year from what we were able to see in that Jets offense. I think the Jets are going to be much better this year on offense. I don't think they're going to be a fantastic team, but I think they're taking a big step forward from where they were. So Carter could be interesting there. Jamison Crowder, who I talked about, did go off the board in the next pick. Then Jalen Tolbert, then McCall Hardman, Kenneth Gainwell, who we talked about, and then Pierce goes off the board there. Shawn, when we're looking at the build so far, we have Joe Burrow, we have Daniel Jones. Are we looking, I think it's a case of value falls in the right way for us, we will add a 3rd quarterback, but are you happy if we decide now that we're not going for another quarterback, or do you think we have to get a 3rd quarterback in this build?
No, I don't think that we have to. The rushing ability of Daniel Jones and the potential for them to be a very pass-heavy offense gives him the upside that you need. Joe Burrow should have tons of consistency there. It's really only if we get to the very end and we love one of the QBs and feel like the rest of it is flat, we have the issue where addressing the tight end position is going to be a little bit of an issue. So probably going to use the third spot there instead of at quarterback. Is that kind of the same way you're looking at it?
Yeah, that's exactly the way. And again, it's trying to give yourself that flexibility as well. So if you we haven't done it to perfection here, if you're trying to get 2 quarterbacks in the window, but we're not far outside it. And I think Daniel Jones, like you said, gives you enough upside and rushing ability that if it's a case that Joe Burrow doesn't work out that week or he's on his bye, Daniel Jones should have enough to get you through that week. If Joe Burrow goes down, this team's going to be in trouble either way. So I think we're going 2 there. Then obviously, you mentioned tight end. That was the next question. We have Pat Fairmouth. We're probably looking to get a 3 tight end build, unless we get Brevin Jordan, in which case we could easily, Shawn, go with 2 tight ends as a joke. That is a joke. We will need 3 tight ends here, I think. And then running backs, we have Jonathan Taylor, J.K. Dobbins, Kareem Hunt, and Michael Carter now. So 4 running backs. But, high end, those top 2 very high end starters, I think. Concerns obviously with Dobbins coming back from his injury, but both him and Taylor, if healthy, are definitely high-end starters. And then you get Kareem Hunt, who potentially there's talks that could get traded. We'll see what happens there. But if he's there, him and Nick Chubb, and I think he gets enough standalone work. Then we have Michael Carter. We talked about his situation with the Jets. How are you feeling about that build? So we still have our 7 wide receivers. We have 4 running backs. How do you think we see this build out if we do go 3 tight ends? What's the balance on running backs to wide receivers the rest of the way?
I don't think that we have to worry about it too much. I think we can take best player available, but with a lean toward filling out the running back position. The thing that was so interesting last year is that we actually had another running back on the bench who would have factored into the flex spot before any wide receivers actually scored ahead of our wide receiver too. So, we're trying to put together a team that even with very strong structure that is going to likely feature 2 tight ends in the flex spot, you still want to come back and make sure you're taking the best players, you're taking the highest upside players, you're taking the players who it's very easy to envision scenarios in which their team either takes a jump, they take a jump, a player ahead of them gets injured. One of the things you're looking at with these situations at all the different positions is what does occur in the case of an injury. Do you need 2 injuries to be relevant? And not just to be out there on the field and scoring points, but does a single injury give you an extreme upside scenario, or does it just move you so that the committee is a little bit different? If you're looking at wide receivers, if you're looking at a Tyler Boyd, you're looking at some of these 49ers or Bengals guys, does 1 injury really shift the dynamic, or do you need multiple injuries, or does it not matter at all? Because for a lot of teams, the injuries, especially at the wide receiver position, are going to be more or less irrelevant. The top players already are sort of looking at a target scenario that is the most that they can sort of legitimately demand when they're out there trying to get away from the defense. That's one of the reasons why things like understanding the target share, understanding the targets per route, those types of elements can be helpful for you kind of as you're building out your board. Colm, we have a lot of interesting wide receiver names still here late. And so this could be a situation that's almost the opposite of last year, where the specifics of the individual draft sort of dictate that we end up with a build that is just really fun at wide receiver.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to seeing how it plays out. When we're looking at some of the options in terms of by ADP, still a lot of running backs at the top of the options. And I think that's the way it's going to go. But as Shawn mentioned, we can kind of lean to upside best player available that we want to go with here. So yeah, I think there's going to be a fun couple of rounds here, Shawn. And of course, if we can draft Brevin Jordan, it'll all just be topped off nicely. So we are at this particular point about half a round away from our next pick. It's always that tricky part of trying to get excited. But what I would really get excited about here, Shawn, is to see 5 to 6 players go off the board that we have no interest in drafting. That would be my dream here.
That is the dream, but that's not extremely likely in an RV draft. We had Wan'Dale Robinson go at the 13-14 14 turn, breaking kind of a string of 4 running backs and 6 picks for Who Stole My Banana, which for anyone who's remembering back to the first episode, selected 7 wide receivers and 1 QB in their first 8 picks, really demonstrating how well zero RB can work for you there. That team has Miles Sanders, Chase Edmonds, Cordero Patterson, and Gus Edwards. I don't know how much upside Edwards is going to have coming off of his injury and behind a player like J.K. Dobbins, although J.K. Dobbins obviously could be, is always one play away from not being there, as all running backs are, and is recovering himself. But to have Miles Sanders in round 9, Chase Edmonds in 10, Cordero Patterson in round 12, again, you can see how drafting wide receivers early led to a lot of value late. At the same time, Colm, a lot of the value that we still do have here, I think, is at wide receiver. And that's one of the reasons why hyper-fragile drafts have been more compelling in 2022 than really any time since 2016.
Yeah, and we did see a few teams start heavy at running back, and after we do these drafts, we will review some off the rosters, but interesting to see how those teams are starting to play out as they dive in and get some of the wide receivers and try and balance out those rosters. But they do go back and pick up a few other running backs along the way, which we'll see if that will work out as they get to the draft's end. But yeah, definitely some of the wide receiver options that are available that can make those hyper fragile builds very interesting. But I think the strategy, Shawn, that we employ, whether it's a modified zero RB, hero RB, a zero RB, or as you mentioned, kind of getting those 3 running backs at the start and the hyper fragile, and then pushing into the wide receivers. I do think that the hyper fragile, the advantage of it in a draft like this is the 3 running backs you get are probably going to be extremely good because of the way this draft is played out. But the wide receivers you get may put you into a little bit of a tricky situation in this here particular room. But some interesting names, Shawn, when we look at wide receiver, they are going, probably 15 picks away from ADP at this point, but the likes of a Robbie Anderson, I think, are very interesting. Our favorite in KJ Hamler, a little bit later, Julio Jones, who we've talked about in a few recent shows, Will Fuller, those kind of veterans who we would expect to get signed. There's a couple of very interesting rookie late tight ends, and Trey McBride and Greg Dulcich as potential options. So we'll see how these next, well, we're on the clock, actually. Those picks went in pretty sharpish as Alexander Madison, Matt Ryan, Tyler Algier all went off the board. Shawn, how are you feeling of playing this particular one out here?
Well, it's pretty appealing to actually try and hit the veterans in Julio and Will Fuller. That, again, I think goes very strongly in the direction of winning this particular league. KJ Hamler already definitely an option. I think that we have to look at a wide receiver here. You don't want some of the teams that went running back early to kind of claw back some of that advantage. The running backs in this spot are not interesting. Do you have a preference between Julio, Will Fuller, and
Let's go Julio. Let's go Julio. The reason I done that as well, we talked about this on one of the recent drafts, so we kind of split it. And that one, I said that I think Julio has probably the most cachet in terms of name value and for the NFL to have him signed to a team that are going to contend. The other player I was going to pitch in there for that goes in the next pick was Robbie Anderson. Based on ADP, I thought there might be a scenario where we take Anderson and then get one of those 2 guys. But we are on the clock again. KJ Hamler, Shawn, was the other guy who went. Shawn's Twitter takes him. So we have Julio. We also have the option here if we want to go Will Fuller. I think Fuller lasts to a later pick, but obviously we won't be picking now for the 24 picks if we want to go that way. Some tight end options that could be available as well if we want to go for any of those. But 25 seconds left in the clock. Do you want to go Will Fuller here based on the draft room, or do you want to look a different direction?
I think so. And it creates kind of a fun build for us here. I think it'll be an advantage later on in terms of winning this particular league. It just gives us so much firepower in a room where so many of the teams are wide receiver heavy. That could be the edge that lets us claw through and get into the playoffs there, where I think a lot of these players are going to show even more upside.
Yeah. And again, we've talked about this in terms of how if they get signed the jump in ADP. Like at the moment, in terms of regular ADP, those guys are going around or 2 rounds or 3 rounds later than we have taken them there. But based on the wide receivers that they're going at, we took them as wide receivers 72 and 75. Would have been nice, Shawn, to get KJ Hamler, but I think that by the time we get to the season, when those guys do get signed, I think that, you know, they are going ahead of the likes of a KJ Hamler. And we love Hamler, but there is extreme competition for targets now in Denver with the 2 tight ends. We potentially might lean in and try and draft one of them later in this draft. And then you have Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy. You know, you have the running backs who we've talked about on the show as well earlier. You know, it's a really competitive situation. So I think Julio and Will Fuller are obviously a little bit different from the guys we're normally trying to draft, those younger guys. But Shawn, we've patched together quite a few veterans in this, and Tyreek Hill, Mike Williams, then we have Tyler Boyd, Julio Jones, and Will Fuller. So we're keeping our age profile up in this draft.
And this is another example of just how difficult it is to execute all of the elements that you want to execute when you're drafting against the OT listeners. They know that those young players have the best chance to absolutely destroy ADP, and they've taken them in spots where we didn't have as much of an opportunity as we might have in many other drafts. Now, we do have Gabriel Davis, who's looking at a massive year 3 breakout. We have Amon-Ra, who it's hard not to dream about what he might do here in year 2. I've spread my exposures out across the Lions. I'm a big Lions fan. I do think, obviously, that TJ Hawkinson is set up for a good season. I love their addition of DJ Chark as a vertical player, and a player who I think they may use in a wider variety of routes and situations than he was used in Jacksonville. It's one of the reasons that he has cited for signing with the Jaguars. And then Jameson Williams, we talked about a little bit earlier. He didn't quite come back to us in round 12, which obviously would have been a dream location. But once they have him going, I think that the Lions are going to put up just an absolute ton of points. I think they're going to be one of the surprise teams in the NFL this year. I have to admit that because I think they're going to score so many points, it's a little surprising to me to see names like Jameis Winston, Matt Ryan, Zach Wilson, Deshaun Watson go ahead of Jared Goff. Jameis Winston looked completely done last season. You know, a lot of people want to say that he was much better at avoiding mistakes, but you know, once you take away Jameis Winston's ability to make mistakes, then I mean, he's a clear backup caliber player. Matt Ryan really struggled, especially without Calvin Ridley last year with the Falcons. Zach Wilson, you pull him up. And we've got some cool articles, series of articles. Anybody who is wanting to go back and is just kind of getting into their research, they're looking at some of these second-year guys making the jump. We have a series that the writers put together looking at the similarity feature in the RotoViz screener. And one of the things you'll note when you see Zach Wilson is that it is a full list of busts that he put up there. So when you consider those different players, the weapons, I think, for Wilson, very, very compelling. We like both Garrett Wilson and Elijah Moore, trying to not overdraft either one of them. One of the reasons, or one of the elements that you can kind of execute with those guys, because you like both, is to, in each draft, you're looking to select one of them, but looking to select the one who slides below ADP in that draft. Obviously, that didn't happen here. We weren't able to get him. Garrett Wilson, I thought, was one of the best values in this draft when he went off the board in the middle of round 8 between Michael Thomas and Marquez Valdes-Scantling. You know, the 3 previous players going ahead of Garrett Wilson were Michael Thomas, Amari Cooper, and Christian Kirk. To be able to get Garrett Wilson after them, that's a massive coup. Right? That doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily work out, but his upside, especially over the second half of the season, his talent level just blows away those players. Now, I mean, if Michael Thomas comes back and is his 25-year-old self, then that comment will look silly. But anytime a player has been rehabbing for literally years, that's not extremely likely. So love Garrett Wilson there. Because of that, I think that Zach Wilson, a guy you have to consider. He's someone who is interesting in Dynasty, even though he's also sort of a sell high. He's still got so much enthusiasm around him because of his receiving core that it provides a little bit of an opportunity to get in and out there. And yet, I mean, Jared Goff is going to be playing with weapons that are far better than anything that he dealt with the Rams. That doesn't mean that he'll be able to put up early Rams production. He was declining when they released him. The coaching staff there with the Los Angeles Rams, obviously fantastic, going to 2 Super Bowls in the last handful of years and winning last year's title. But I don't know. We're 24 quarterbacks in, and Jared Goff has not been selected. I mean, Jared Goff played in a Super Bowl.
It just has been selected. I think maybe it went a bit too far there. He had to come off the board. He's quarterback 25. I have some wagers on Shawn this year, and this might be down to my dislike of Kirk Cousins and I guess probably getting it rubbed off from you, the over-ambitious side of Jared Goff. I have a few wagers that Jared Goff outscores Kirk Cousins this year in fantasy points. So we'll see how they turn out. But yeah, in terms of quarterback 25, I think it's a good build. And it's actually interesting that it's the team that has Jameis Winston on it that takes Jared Goff. Maybe he's just he thought through the process that you were talking about to get somebody to cover for Jameis Winston. But we have about 6 picks, Shawn, before we pick again. We have 1 tight end. Some of the options that are going to be available to us at the top of the queue if we were going by ADP. I'm not really drafting James Robinson based on the injury he had and that comeback to see how he does. We're obviously looking more there at getting Travis Etienne, Khalil Herbert's there, JD McKissick. Haven't drafted much of those guys at all this year. Somebody we had in the queue was Paris Campbell. He goes off the board. Cameron Brate's there, Mark Ingram, Darrell Williams. Somebody, Shawn, going to bring up that name again. We need tight ends. Brevin Jordan is in the queue there as well. Is this the point where I get my Brevin Jordan pick, or are we looking in a different direction?
Well, Colm, I mean, it's falling all into place for you. That's for sure. When we've had names
Shawn
like
says
Thomas,
that. Shawn says that as he starts to pray that the Brevin Jordan gets selected here in the next 3 picks.
Well, there are 3 more picks, and he could go, and that would be my preference. But he's currently behind Logan Thomas, Austin Hooper, and Mo Alley Cox. And at that juncture, he does start to look interesting. He's been a good player, and he's played above his athleticism. NFL tight ends who tend to break out do tend to be more athletic than Brevin Jordan. And in most cases, they're going to be in a much better team environment. But Brevin Jordan doesn't have a lot to compete with the Houston Texans. You have Brandon Cooks, and then the other names there in Nico Collins and John Mechie. I guess I'm not enthusiastic about their chances, again, given the overall offense. If you were the 3rd guy on a fantastic team, those names would be very different. Colm, we're 1 pick away. He's still there. Curtis Samuel, Darrell Williams go here. I mean, this isn't a bad time to take LaVisca. I do wonder
That is amazing, Shawn. That is absolutely amazing. I do not know how much you paid the guy in the 3rd spot to take Brevin Jordan. Oh, I cannot believe that. I'm not, and just to be clear, this is kind of a bet. I'm not like all in on Brevin Jordan. It's just something that happened in a draft a couple of weeks ago, and we've kind of kept it going. But I cannot believe that. We're going to have fun reviewing this draft after, Shawn. The other players that we were about to touch on, Chenault is there at wide receiver. The tight ends we're looking to get are Trey McBride and Greg Dulcich, but this is an area as well where Chris Evans and Jerick McKinnon, Sony Michel also go off the board. Do you want to get Chenault, or I think we should go for one of the running backs.
Oh, I was going to say this might be a good time to double dip on the tight ends. I don't know if we want to let Trey McBride slide through, but McBride and Chenault, I think both good selections.
Let's go for McBride then. We can talk it through then after that. So we take McBride. In terms of looking at wide receivers, I think Chenault may go, but looking at, at that point, I think he might have slid through. The wide receivers available now based on ADP are Beckham, Menchie, Marshall, Duvernay, and then Chenault. So yeah, I think if we did want to go Chenault, this is the time. Do you think that based on the running backs we have, based on the wide receivers we have, which is more important? We have those 4 running backs and Michael Carter, J.K. Dobbins, Kareem Hunt, and Jonathan Taylor. Chris Evans, Jerick McKinnon, or Sony Michel. Do you feel that they might be a better pairing?
I don't know that any of the running backs scream out to me as must-haves. I think the running back room overall is strong enough that James Robinson becomes interesting because he could be that playoff hammer. I don't expect him to be ready until the end of the season, but that's kind of what we're targeting with some of these late picks. Chris Evans, a lot of upside. Jarrett McKinnon, a lot of upside. Sony, a lot of upside. They all feel like players who are 18th, 19th, 20th round guys. If we wanted to add one more receiver in here and kind of have a little fun with it by taking Shenault, who obviously has been synonymous with OT and RotoViz, then I think that would be a fun play. I'm also interested to see where Dulcich actually does go, even though he doesn't have an ADP.
Yeah, I think that in this room, I think that we could miss out on him, but I think we'll go with Shenault. We'll see what happens then at tight end. My whole thought process has just been derailed with the devastation of missing out on Brevin Jordan. But McBride and Shenault there. I understand what you're saying as well with the running back options, and I do think there is an outside chance that someone of those do slide back to. So you mentioned James Robinson. I mentioned the concerns around the injury. The running back room we have here may be able to sustain that recovery until he is back. But in terms of running backs currently available, Khalil Herbert, Robinson, Ingram, Jamal Williams, Deontay Foreman, Mostert, Zamir White, Chris Evans, McKinnon, and Sony. So at that point, there is also Benjamin that may be available. But when we look at those running backs, Shawn, there is a chance in this room also that they do slide back to us. So that would be nice if we get some of those options. And Greg Dulcich, who we weren't sure how long he would last, goes off the board 5 picks later. So the double dip, Shawn, would have worked out there. We do pass. Still feels like we do need that third tight end in the build, but we'll see what options are available. Is that part of your thinking, though, that while you did mention the running backs not being overly exciting, that they may work back to us here in the next round?
Well, I don't necessarily think that our guys are. That's, again, one of the downsides of doing a listener league draft like this. The reason I had kind of mentioned going with the double dip of tight ends there is I do think that Dulcich is the last draftable tight end. And so I think that despite the weakness at the position, you kind of locked yourself into just 2 if you don't get Dulcich as the last guy. Now, if we were talking about the very last pick in round 20, Tommy Tremble has some appeal for me now that they have Baker Mayfield. If they hadn't had Mayfield, I don't think there would be much potential for him to have a second-year breakout. But in that situation, you're talking about a very athletic player, probably didn't get the full chance in college to show that, but was immediately part of Carolina's game plan, got some red zone carries even. I don't necessarily think that kind of thing will carry over, especially if Christian McCaffrey is healthy, but it gives you a sense of how the coaching staff wants to get him involved. And so he could be a guy who makes that second year leap, probably again, a 20th round selection. And you have opportunities there with Cameron Brayton, Cade Otton, but the more likely thing, I think, is that the Tampa Bay tight end position becomes just an empty smoking hole there. And I don't know that that's the best way to use it. Again, if we had 23, 24 picks, if you were talking about the FFPC Classic, a really cool format that goes 28 rounds long, you definitely need to have 3 tight ends in that format. Then perhaps the Tampa Bay tight ends become more interesting. I do think that Jonnu Smith is possibly a 20th round selection, but in a couple of these situations here, we looked at the double dip at tight end, decided not to make it. In both cases, we probably should have.
Yeah, it didn't work out. So we will be reviewing the rosters after we wrap it up. We might check back on those 2v2s to see how things could have played out differently, but yeah, a couple of rounds here, 3 selections left, Shawn. We'll see how it does play out for us. I'm still very positive about this roster overall. Real challenging draft so far. So the last 3 picks could be crucial for seeing who wins this. One of these teams obviously will advance to the playoffs. The top 2 teams in each division will advance, and then we'll see how teams do after that. So our goal here is to be in the top 2. Obviously, if you win, that is beneficial, but being in the top 2 is the key.
Colm, other than losing Dulcich, round 17 hasn't been that big a problem for us. The players drafted in Mechie, Duvernay, Khalil Herbert, Jamal Williams, Ryan Tannehill, Brian Edwards, Terrace Marshall, those guys are not players who were necessarily on our list. It does give a little bit of a feel for how the drafts can get deep and get barren very quickly. That said, having those guys go in round 17 for us does increase the chances that our player targets will wrap back around to the 18-19 turn. We still have approximately 12 guys to go before that happens.
We do have the 12 guys to go. We'll see how that's going to roll out here. It's always interesting when we get into these late rounds. We do have a lot of guys that we do like, but based on how the draft has played out, and I'm just looking at, when we talked about drafting from back to front and looking through the scenarios, for example, like Laviska Shenault is a 20th round target for us in terms of ADP. That's where he normally goes. Will Fuller was there. KJ Hamler, who is somebody we didn't get. They kind of be the 18-19 turn in this kind of format. But that also means that some guys do get pushed down that normally would be going ahead of that. You touched earlier on Wendell Robinson going off the board. He usually goes in the 16-17 turn range if you're at our selection of the 102. But Evans, McKinnon, Michelle, they're all players that are sliding down here a little bit in terms of where, they normally would be a target in the 16th round, whereas in this one it's going to be the 18th or 19th. So we just kind of flip those guys around. Jerick McKinnon does go off the board, then Davis Mills, then Taysom Hill. So Shawn, we are waiting patiently to see if some of these guys get back to us. Who is the dream pick here? I continue to mention the running back options that are available. They are still available for us, all of them, in fact, that we've talked about previously. And then if we did want to dip in, Shawn had been talking about these reports of New England and the usage of Jonnu Smith. I don't know if Shawn had reported those himself, but we've joked about that a few times. But he is still available. Shawn, have you heard any more or dreamt any more about the season that Jonnu Smith's going to have?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good time to start making up more rumors about Jonnu Smith being more involved as a receiver. The player that we lose here, one of the other options for us when we have the second to last pick in the draft, I think would be if a QB came to that point who had hybrid ability and the potential to be someone who's playing at the end. Marcus Mariota, I think, would fall into that category. Desmond Ridder, I continue to read very positive things from the Falcons about him. It makes it very difficult to play that offense because you're looking almost certainly at a mid-season swap, but I think that Mariota could score pretty well before that happens when you consider the rushing ability. And they don't have to take care of him because he's not the quarterback of the future the way the Tennessee Titans were trying to back at the beginning when they had selected him up there at the beginning of the draft, and he was being looked at as the quarterback of the future. Desmond Ridder is going to go in there mid-season. At that point, we'll get a sense of whether he can keep it up with weapons like Drake London and Kyle Pitts. When you have a couple guys like that, you have some chances. Then you have that third sort of big receiver / running back in Cordero Patterson. When you consider the offensive environment there in the NFC South, in the Dome, I think the Falcons could be one of these sneaky types of teams where you want to have just a little bit more exposure than maybe ADP indicates that you should. But Mariota does go, and he actually goes as the fourth QB. So one of the teams that waited outside the QB window for all of his selections now has Mac Jones, Jameis Winston, Jared Goff, Marcus Mariota. Colm, I like that in many ways, but it is tough if you're going to burn 4 spots on QB in this type of format. You likely end up without enough firepower to their positions, and we can kind of see that in the way that Sammy Watkins and Brian Edwards were his 2 most recent draft picks. Now, both of those guys do fall into situations where they could have an opportunity to get volume, but it is volume that, based on their recent production, will be hard for them to capitalize on. Chris Evans goes. He was the back I was really hoping who would come back to us. Sony Michel, Eno Benjamin, the top guys on our board right now, as James Robinson went as the third pick in this round. We see Donovan Peoples-Jones, so the third wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns. We're at wide receivers 93, 94 here with Zay Jones. you're obviously in this dynamic where when the third receiver for the Browns, the third, fourth receiver for the Jaguars, teams that are not expected to pass the ball very effectively, when those players are being drafted, it gives you a little bit of a sense of why, perhaps addressing the position before that point is beneficial. I say that, sort of half pointing the finger back at us because we drafted Laviska Shenault, who could easily end up being below some of those guys on the totem pole. Colm, we're back up. Sony Michel and Eno Benjamin have made it around. Jonnu Smith has made it around. One of the players
any interest in taking a shot on Cameron Brate? Not really.
I just, again, it seems like a crater. I don't know what to make of it. If the beat reporters are saying that a unappealing rookie tight end is ahead of Brate, I mean, Brate has seemed to be a good player. Those are reports that my guess would be are going to turn out to be erroneous, but the people on the ground do have insights that those of us who are just, kind of making up Patriots rumors from a long way away don't have. And so you have to pay attention to that. If that workload there gets split between Otton and Brate, then again, you're talking more like a 25 round draft before I think you can make those plays.
Yeah, it's just interesting with if Gronk doesn't play, which I still have my doubts around. There has to be value in, even if it's split work, as a tight end tree on a roster. Eno Benjamin is who we did select. That's who I was hoping we would select. Shawn made the selection stealthily there while talking through the situation. Are we going back here, Shawn, for Sony Michel? We've kind of joked throughout this about how deep the draft is going at wide receiver. The wide receiver that we want to get is kind of a 20th round guy. That is Tyquan Thornton, but we're in the 19th round, Shawn. Do we want to take him and just get him on the roster? Or do you want to go back here to Sony Michel?
I'll leave that up to you. I mean, we are a little bit thin at the running back position. We are being given a gift here of Sony in round 19. Yeah. I mean, Tyquan Thornton, before I get into that, Sony Michel, your guy here?
I think we should, yeah. I think for the roster. When we go into the luck to see how far we have to scroll down before we get to Tyquan Thornton, which in my opinion is crazy. Like in terms of, he's not on the first 10 wide receivers by order. He's kind of in the 13 range, but he is currently going 2 wide receiver spots ahead of N'Keal Harry, for example. He's going after a lot of guys. Josh Gordon is going 3 spots after him. So there's a lot of guys, but Shawn, I'll let you talk about Thornton, but for example, in the underdog drafts, which are 18 rounds, he is going undrafted a lot of the time. How optimistic are you on him landing with the Patriots for this season?
Well, I mean, I don't understand the current situation. I mean, he should have been picked at the very least. I mean, you could argue that we should have picked him at the 17:02. I don't understand necessarily Curtis Samuel, who was blocked going ahead of him. I don't necessarily understand Isaiah McKenzie, Isaiah McKenzie is fantastic, right? He's a very good reality player, elite speed. He's going to have probably a couple of games where that speed comes into play and, he gets the 4 or 5 catches. I thought that they should have used him more, but the fact that they have added Jameson Crowder, who is a big upgrade on Cole Beasley, they've drafted Khalil Shakir. It's difficult to see where he would get the volume that you would need. Corey Davis, we talked about some of the risks and the problems with Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson. I mean, Corey Davis is, when you're talking about third receivers being drafted on bad offenses, that part doesn't necessarily make sense to me. It doesn't necessarily make sense to have Kendrick Bourne go at the 15-10 and Thornton not be drafted when you consider kind of how they plan to use Thornton. Kendrick Bourne, again, is one of my favorite players, so I'm not against people being a fan of him. He is more dynamic than the other guys that they have previously in terms of Jacoby Myers and Nelson Aguilar, but the offense is already kind of split in such a fashion that players like Devontae Parker, who goes in between Wandale and Nico Collins at the 14:02. It's difficult to see how those players necessarily score to the level that they're being drafted at. But when you're talking about an 18th, 19th, 20th round pick on Thornton, and Thornton does go in the 19th round to
Heartbreaking.
our pretty fun team here that has the 4
They
QBs.
they are listening to every podcast we do. We have to give them credit for that, Shawn, because they have just, as you talk these players through, they have just taken them off the board.
Well, I mean, this is a team that in the first 6 rounds has 3 running backs and 3 tight ends, but they have no other running backs. This is probably, I mean, again, this is one of my favorite teams of all time. I don't think it's really going to work. You don't want to have more quarterbacks than you have running backs. You probably need to get to 4, even if you take Joe Mixon, Leonard Fournette, and Cam Akers. You probably don't need Dallas Goedert there. It does put a real hammer down on the rest of us, and it put you and me into a real bind that we didn't navigate very well with the tight ends that we got. Going back to Thornton, I mean, again, this is a player that the Patriots are extremely high on. You say that and you're like, well, I mean, the Patriots have not been good at drafting wide receivers. How much weight should we put into that? But I think if you're going to draft a Patriots player, you want it to be the guy who has the combination of price and upside. For me, that's Thornton because of the elite speed and because I think Mac Jones, despite mediocre arm strength, is someone who can get that ball out early. He's going to do very well with his receivers being in space. Again, this is a pick here where Mac Jones is being placed with both Jacoby Myers and Tyquan Thornton. My preference would probably be to split those guys up on different teams as opposed to have that much exposure to the Patriots passing game. But you can see what the drafter is trying to do. Now we have a couple other fun players go here, Colm, as Tylan Wallace goes as wide receiver 101. We are now into the 100s at wide receiver.
We're 100 wide receivers deep.
Yes, so
wide receiver is deep, though, Shawn. It is deep. There are 100 wide receivers you can draft.
There are hundreds of wide receivers you can draft. I
don't know if I've ever seen. I'll have to go back and check. We're into the 101s. That's amazing. There's currently James White goes off the board, running back 67. Obviously, you want to get, see what you can do with the Patriots backfield. But if you're listening to Stealing Bananas over the last week or so, you got to get those T-shirts printed, Shawn, with Ty Montgomery's name on them as RB1 2022. But Thornton was the pick I was just hoping would come back to us. There is still options. We do have Johnny Smith, who we touched on, Tommy Tremble, who touched on, Desmond Ridder as an option. But when we're getting those 100 wide receivers deep, it gets a little bit tricky to see what options that we could also go for. Any other high upside potential flyers that you'd be looking to go after here? Another thing that I find interesting, and obviously we're still waiting on the news to come down as to what happens with Deshaun Watson, but Deshaun Watson in this drafted in the 15th round. Jacoby Brissett is likely to go undrafted in a best ball format. I think that, teams who are struggling for quarterback depth, it's interesting to see that he could potentially be a starter for 17 games this season and is likely going to go undrafted in this league.
Right. But there are still other QBs with some upside who you probably would consider instead. I do have Desmond Ridder in our queue for that potential.
Oh yeah, definitely would be taking Ridder over him. I definitely but I'm just surprised in general people are looking for that little bit of safety.
Kenny Pickett is someone who is fairly interesting again in round 20. But Colm, we're going to have a difficult choice here. Hassan Haskins, the backup for Derrick Henry, still available, almost certainly the best overall value at this point if we want to add a 7th wide receiver. Really, our build needs a 3rd QB or a 3rd tight end, but we put ourselves into a situation where there aren't any super compelling picks at those positions. Wide receiver we definitely don't need. When we're looking at the 3 guys here with Tyler Beatty, one of our favorites, being selected, Jonnu, Desmond Ridder, Haskins goes a couple picks ahead. Tommy Tremble, the other tight end I had been talking about as a potential very late round pick, goes in the middle of this round, so he will not be an option for us. Little by little, it's getting whittled down to where the choice may be made by our league mates.
Yeah, it feels like we have two names in the queue. We have Johnny Smith. Oh my goodness, with Johnny Smith and Desmond Ritter. Johnny Smith goes off the board, so we're back. We're one pick away, but Braxton Berrios was next. Shawn, the option that we have in the queue is Desmond Ritter, but is there anyone else that, like, the build overall probably does need a third tight end, but there's nobody really here that I think that you could punt on. Troutman is like the starting tight end for the Saints, but not exciting. Uzama is the starting tight end for the Jets, but not exciting. Is there any benefit to taking one of those guys over the third quarterback to try and have that little bit of tight end depth, or do we just risk it here and go with Ritter?
I think we should take the fun play and go with Desmond Ritter. If Jonnu had made it, that probably would have been the direction. You can still take the starting tight end or one of the rumored starting tight ends for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers if you want to go that route. We have 11 seconds.
We could go for Ricky Seals-Jones, tight end for the Giants.
You never want to be taking the...
Shawn, I knew no matter what I said there, we were going to take Desmond Ritter. So let's never hope at the end of the season we're not saying Ricky Seals-Jones. What a season! And he was really what, like, made Daniel Jones take that leap in 2022.
Yeah, no,
I don't think that's happening.
Daniel Bellinger, the presumed starting tight end for the New York Giants, despite being a mediocre rookie prospect. Now, he is someone who's generated rave reviews in the offseason work. That is one of the reasons I think the wide receivers there are maybe a little bit more compelling than they're being given credit for. The tight end position, you wouldn't expect to siphon off a huge number of targets, but Colm obviously joking about taking backup tight ends in that.
Like Brevin Jordan.